In the early hours of the 19th of July 1969, a black Oldsmobile skidded and crashed off the side of a narrow bridge at the end of a dirt road crossing a tidal pond. The car ended up, upside down, submerged in the fast-flowing current beneath the bridge.
The automobile's departure was from halfway between this first set of pilings and this bulkhead right here to my left. And where the automobile wound up was over 36 feet from there, which is actually at the leading edge of the far ramp. And he wound up in the water right over here, just to the right of the tide ripple that you see here.
Just after 8:30 in the morning, local police chief Jim Arena arrived on the scene and attempted to get into the car.
I tried to go under. I'll be honest with you, I'm probably a good swimmer, but I'm a very lousy underwater swimmer. I went under several times to see if I could, take a look in, but each time I did, the tide sort of took me along. So I gave that thought up, and I boosted myself up and sat on the car and waited for the arrival of other help.
Because of the nature of the call, we were already dressed by the time we got here. I was in dive gear, ready to go, and proceeded over to that anvil-headed piling there. I went over to that and went into the water from that side. As I approached the rear of the automobile, which would face that way, I saw 2 feet in the rear window.
Bob Bruguera arrived, and I shouted up to him the number of the car, the registration number. Now, at that time, we had a system of what they call the Polk directory. I think it still exists, but it was a directory of registration numbers. And in a very short period of time, he called back to me and said the car is registered to Edward Kennedy out of Boston, I guess the office in Boston. My reaction was then, my goodness, another Kennedy tragedy, and still not knowing whether or not anybody was in there.
I proceeded to the nearest window, which is the right rear, and put my hand inside and felt, unfortunately at that time, felt that it was a body in which rigor mortis had already set.
John Farrar retrieved the body of a young woman from the car and brought her up to Jim Arena.
Well, when he came up out of the water with this woman, it certainly was a shock to me to see that there was, in fact, somebody there. And to tell you the truth, my immediate reaction was to look at her and wonder who this was. In other words, I guess I was thinking to myself, is this one of the Kennedy clan? They generally really have a look that they almost all look alike. It's a terrible thing to say, but a lot of them resemble each other. And I thought, well, it might be somebody that I know, but it wasn't. And I thought as she laid in my lap, waiting for a ride, waiting for the boat, that, it was a strange thing to say, but I said at the time that she looked unruffled, if you follow me. Her clothes were in order and everything else. It looked as though if you propped her up, you could take her to a party or something. And the only signs that I saw of her, there was a slight foaming coming out of her mouth and nose, but obviously to me she was deceased.
After some initial confusion caused by the discovery of a handbag in the wrecked car, which in the event turned out not to belong to the victim, the body was identified as that of Mary Jo Kopechne, and she had indeed been to a party. The party was held on the island of Chappaquiddick, a short ferry ride from the small resort of Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard, off the coast of Massachusetts. 12 people, 6 men and 6 women, attended the party the previous evening here at this rented holiday cottage on Chappaquiddick Island. The cottage was just under a mile from the bridge where the accident was to occur. Senator Kennedy himself was not planning to stay at the cottage, but to return to Edgartown and stay at the Shiretown Inn. The afternoon before the party, Senator Kennedy was taken to the cottage and then onto the beach for a swim. The car travelled to an intersection near the cottage and then turned right onto a dirt road, at the other end of which lay the bridge. This turn was to emerge later as being of some significance. The group that Senator Kennedy met up with on the beach and later at the party were all political colleagues. The women were a group known as the Boiler Room Girls, who worked together for Bobby Kennedy's campaign for the presidency in 1968. One close colleague of Mary Jo Kopechne, who was at the party, was Rosemary Keogh. The Boiler Room Girls have always refused to talk about the death of their friend, Mary Jo, Now Rosemary Keogh speaks out for the first time.
I always get upset because I think that, because of what happened, there's some effort to have turned her into a saint. And she was a normal, red-blooded American girl like all the rest of us. She was hardworking, she was energetic, she was funny, she had a wonderful wit. She drove around in a cute little Volkswagen Bug. She dressed nicely and wore short skirts like all the rest of us did at that time. She wasn't a saint. She was a nice, lovely girl who was very dedicated to what we were all dedicated to. It was a time of great commitment, and it was a time that people had to stand tall and take a stand on Vietnam and on civil rights and on the way we thought the country was going. And we were young people that really believed in all that. It wasn't, now it seems, all that seems trite because politics has gotten much more cynical. But it wasn't trite to us then.
It was an incredibly intense feeling. It was also supercharged by the fact it was only 5 years after President Kennedy himself had been assassinated. So there was all of that passion as well. It was an enormously passionate year. Martin Luther King was murdered in the middle of the process. Cities were burning. It's hard to think back sometimes how intense that was.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago and let's win there.
Only 5 years after President Kennedy was shot, his brother Bobby Kennedy, just 3 months into his own campaign for the presidency, was himself assassinated.
Senator Kennedy has been shot, and another man, a Kennedy campaign manager, and possibly shot in the head. I am right here. Rayford Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot.
After this second Kennedy tragedy, the natural focus for the Boiler Room Group became the surviving brother, Edward Kennedy.
To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it.
The bonding that goes on in that circumstance is so powerful that it's hard not to want to be with the people and to relive and share the awful absence because of the assassination, the tragedy, the what might have been, the what was lost, just that emptiness. You have to deal with that. So who do you deal it with but the people you're closest to and had bonded most with? So yes, they spent a lot of time with each other, and naturally so, I think, and wonderfully so. It was a great healing process.
Part of that need for mutual support was filled by leisure time get-togethers at the Kennedy summer home in Hyannisport, or sometimes at nearby resorts such as Martha's Vineyard. In the aftermath of the accident, the press were quick to speculate about these events in lurid terms.
That whole myth of this bunch of single girls being sort of served up to married men for some other purpose just didn't happen. It didn't happen. And it wasn't what it was about. And the relationships were not that way. So you never had a feeling of concern about going somewhere I went to Salt Lake City with Senator Edward Kennedy and Don Gifford and just the three of us together, and never felt threatened or concerned. And, my mother didn't worry. And my sister didn't worry. No one worried.
On the morning of Saturday the 19th of July, shortly after the body was recovered from the car, Dr. Mills, the local medical examiner, arrived on the scene. In normal circumstances, where death was not obviously the result of natural causes, an autopsy would have been ordered.
Dr. Mills said, well, it certainly looks like a simple drowning, John, but he said the autopsy will tell. I thought nothing of that, because an autopsy would be a normal thing to do where you had so many questions as to the cause of death. And but that was a statement which was going to come and haunt poor Donald for a long time.
Unsure of how to proceed because of the people involved, Dr. Mills sought advice from the district attorney's office about an autopsy. The reply he received was ambiguous and was to lead to bitter dissension later on. Dr. Mills' colleague in the practice was Dr. Nevin.
Things were sort of being hinted and said, be a good guy and don't obstruct the Kennedys and play the game and you'll not have any problems. I felt that an autopsy was in order and that it was certain inevitable questions were going to be asked that I would feel happier and more comfortable if they could be answered appropriately, and the only appropriate way that I knew of was with an autopsy. And I think the facts have borne me out, but there's just two different opinions. Republicans and Democrats, you know.
Senator Kennedy had spent the night at his hotel in Edgartown without reporting the accident. Now, accompanied by his two aides, cousin Joseph Gargan and lawyer Paul Markham, who had also been at the party, he made the short ferry crossing from Edgartown back to Chappaquiddick Island. They reached Chappaquiddick just as the rescue team was getting underway at the other end of the island.
Dick Hewitt and I picked the senator up on the Edgartown side in the morning, and we brought him with two other men over to Chappie here. And he walked off the ferry and walked over to the ferry shed with us a telephone, and he was in there for quite a while. And in the meantime, a tow truck and a doctor came over, and we'd heard there was an accident somewhere by the Dyke Bridge. And after Kennedy was in the shed for quite a while, Dick said, why don't you go ask him if he needs a hand or if he knows about the accident? So I went over to the shed and I asked him, I said, do you need a hand? Did you hear there was an accident? And one of the fellows said, yeah, we heard about it.
Did they seem upset at all?
They seemed agitated. Kennedy that morning seemed depressed. He seemed kind of dragged out.
Kennedy spent some time on the phone at the Chappaquiddick landing. By the time he finished, it was at least 9:30 a.m. and he had still not reported the accident. But wherever Kennedy and his friends were bound for when they crossed on the ferry, they now abandoned the trip and returned hastily to Edgartown. When Police Chief Jim Arena returned to his office in the town hall, he found Kennedy there waiting for him. At this point, Kennedy straightened out Arena about the identity of the victim. He also made a surprising admission of liability.
Senator was sitting there, and Paul Markham was there. I recognized Paul Markham. Senator stood up, said, hi, Jim. And I said, hello, Senator. And I said, I'm sorry about the accident. He said something to the effect, yes, I know. I was the driver. And that somewhat took me back a little bit. But then I said, well, do you know if anybody's contacted Miss Keogh's family? And he said something generally that it wasn't Miss Keogh, it was Rosemary Keogh, was Mary Jo Kopechne. And I have contacted her family. Then the next comment was something to the effect that, what should we do next? We must do what's right, because if we don't, both of us will be criticized for it, something to that effect. And I said, well, first thing I would like from you is a statement. And I think they may have asked whether or not the written would be okay, and I said sure. And also my office was starting to, believe it or not, we were attracting news people even by then. And I let him in the selectman's office, which was down the hallway, he and Markham, and I went back to the scene.
The statement, which took Kennedy an hour to compose, explained that he left the party at approximately 11:15 the previous evening with Miss Kopechne to catch the ferry back to Edgartown. On his way to the ferry, he had mistakenly turned onto a dirt road that led to an unlit bridge and crashed off the bridge. When the car sank, he had no recollection of how he got out, but he remembered making an unsuccessful attempt to rescue Miss Kopechne. Exhausted and in a state of shock, he returned to his friends and was then brought back to Edgartown. He said when he fully realized what had happened the next morning, he immediately contacted the police. Armed with the statement, Police Chief Arena met up with Walter Steele, now a judge, who was then public prosecutor for Dukes County.
I came to where the police station was then located, right near the courthouse. And Jim Arena, who was at that time the police chief, told me that Kennedy drove a car off a bridge. And I said, that's preposterous. You know, senators don't drive cars off bridges. In my opinion, they didn't do it in those days. So he said, yeah, and that was the first I heard about it. I was at that time the county prosecutor, but because of the statute that created this office, I thought I should clear with the district attorney, who was then, the office was in New Bedford. And I did this, however, through Jim Marina. He called, he got District Attorney Denise, and I believe his words, said, well, is this just an accident? And I think Jim said, yes, it appears to be. He said, well, you fellas handle it over there. And that's what we did.
I had now been thrown into a situation where I was not only the chief and the investigator, but I was also the press man. By mid-morning, we were inundated with media people. By noontime, we couldn't move. And by early afternoon, the pressure on me to release a statement to the press was enormous. I hadn't heard from Senator Kennedy and Paul Markham. At that time, under the pressure, I read the statement to news people gathered at the station.
One of those present was NBC reporter Liz Trotter, who felt she learned little from interviewing Jim Arena.
Here he was, it was quite obvious, here he was, a small-town sheriff. All of a sudden he's talking to a network television crew. And I caught a sense of that because he seemed so overwhelmed by our presence. He wasn't a blithering idiot, that's not what I don't suggest that, but there was a kind of corny, small-town flavor about the whole thing, and you couldn't help but realize that this man was very much on the spot because a U.S. Senator was involved in God knows what at this point.
Meanwhile, Dunn Gifford, one of the two men who had formed part of the Boiler Room group, arrived in Edgartown on Kennedy's behalf to take care of the kind of details thrown up by such an incident.
It was a difficult few days. Part of the difficulty was the fact that it was highly unusual circumstances, great pressure and public scrutiny, which would not have been the case had it not been the United States Senator, a member of the Kennedy family, a young unmarried woman, and a death and a car accident in the middle of the night and all that. So there were those, again, I think that's an overlay. In normal circumstances, it would have been take care of the arrangements, get the necessary paperwork done, you have to cross state lines, you have to deal with a lot of other things like that that are difficult to deal with, and just get it done and get on with it. It happens every day, thousands of times all over the world. This one was different. There's no question about that. The difficulty was the uncertainty. You never quite knew where you were next going to get a jab from.
While Gifford was looking after the administration, Kennedy hurriedly left the island, leaving the PR in the hands of his pressman, Dick Drain, whose job was to keep the press at bay.
Dick Drain's line was to sort of casually hang around and shoot the breeze, be completely relaxed, laugh and joke, but not ever really telling you anything. I was fairly brash in those days and really was rather bewildered by what I thought was a sense of cutting slack, ready to give them the benefit of the doubt. Another Kennedy tragedy, arm's length, keep it polite, keep it gentlemanly.
I was not going to participate in any unjust assault on Kennedy because I'm a Democrat. I knew Paul Markham slightly. I had been an assistant district attorney under a Democratic regime in Boston. So I was not going to be perceived as somebody who would join in an unjust attack on Kennedy's public reputation. On the other hand, I was not going to suppress anything. I was going to do my job, but not happily. I was shocked when, in fact, he admitted driving the automobile. And then when Jim said, that he admitted being the operator, and then I knew, and I told Jim there was a problem because of the passage of time. That was conduct of possible criminal significance. It's called, to use the shorthand term, leaving the scene of an accident after knowingly causing bodily injury.
Yeah, you had to decide whether this was a police story or a political story. in my mind, I had decided this was a police story, and I really didn't care about, and maybe that was short-sighted at the moment, but we weren't sitting around pondering what the historical implications of this thing were going to be. I mean, it was a dead girl, and who often got lost in the shuffle of this whole thing. It always struck me that in the age of feminism, what would happen now if there was a dead girl, and would all the women involved behave justly? I mean, you couldn't get your hands on anyone, any witnesses, the party girls, no one. There was nobody, everybody was buttoned up. But there was still this dead girl. So it was a police story, but nobody seemed to be acting like the police.
For one thing, Police Chief Arena failed to interview some of those closest to the event, the other girls at the party. His excuse that he couldn't get hold of them is challenged by Rosemary Keogh.
No one asked me to come in and talk. Nobody asked me to answer any questions. I believe that people were informed of where we were, and I think people were informed that we were leaving.
The funeral of Mary Jo Kopechne, 4 days after the accident, brought Kennedy out of the seclusion of his family home at Hyannisport. Immediately after the funeral, Kennedy and his entourage returned there. It soon became clear that they were going to do everything possible to suppress the story. Kennedy was confronted by NBC reporter Liz Trotter, demanding a statement.
When do you think you might have a statement, Senator, to clear up some of the... Is there any way of giving us indication as to when that appropriate time will be? Is there any way of giving us indication?
Kennedy refused to be drawn. Not long afterwards, a Kennedy aide made a sinister call to NBC, demanding that Trotter be removed from her job.
Oh, I was very much given to believe that my job was at risk. I was told by a vice president at NBC News that the Kennedy people had in fact contacted the network and had very strongly hinted that I should be taken off the story. To their credit, they were not about to do that. I mean, it was kind of raw power reaching out. I think I thought at the time, God, there's not even a velvet glove on this. I mean, there's not what we would call nowadays a spin. It was just naked. Lay off, take a fall, throw the fight, whatever expression.
It wasn't just the press who were excluded. At home at Hyannisport, Kennedy remained inaccessible even to the legal authorities.
We became a little impatient when voluntary cooperation did not happen in the next few days. And then both Jim and I became a little upset about it. I don't know how many days, but we demanded some contact by somebody, preferably an attorney.
Eventually, the Kennedy team offered a deal. When Kennedy appeared in court a week after the accident, it was to plead guilty to the relatively minor charge of leaving the scene of an accident after knowingly causing injury, a plea that was secretly agreed in advance. The question is, should he have faced the more serious charge of manslaughter?
We were going to be very careful, and we would not seek any criminal complaints that we could not substantiate with evidence. Manslaughter at that time, that type of manslaughter, required a proof of willful, wanton, and reckless conduct. Not what happened after the accident, but at the time. This is usually proved by speeds, 80, 90 miles an hour, in congested areas. I mean, you need a lot of evidence to prove what we call common law manslaughter. We didn't think we had it at the time, and so we sought the highest complaint, criminal complaint, that we thought was appropriate.
Kennedy appeared in person here at the Edgartown Courthouse on the 25th of July, where he was charged with leaving the scene of an accident after knowingly causing injury. As agreed in advance, he pleaded guilty and was given a 2-month suspended sentence and a year's probation.
He didn't seem terribly nervous or flustered. He seemed contrite. His wife was in attendance, and other members of his family and friends, especially those people close to him, political allies. But his conduct was well within the realm of normal behavior. There was a lot of quiet excitement, of course, in the courtroom, and it was heavily covered by the media.
Once the trial is over, the Kennedy camp has a problem. Kennedy stands there exposed to full public gaze, and the conviction has badly tarnished his image.
What is Senator Kennedy going to do? Is he going to resign? Is he going to run again? Is he going to make a speech, not make a speech, give an interview, not give an interview? And those are part of the baggage that comes with being a political figure. Had he been a private individual, that issue wouldn't have surfaced. It would have been just him and his lawyers and the court system.
I have made my plea, and I've requested the networks for time this evening to make a report to the people of Massachusetts. Thank you very much.
The TV speech that evening was a carefully manicured team job. Whilst he amplified his original statement, the inconsistencies in his story remained unexplained. It was an emotional appeal to his own electorate in Massachusetts.
Today, as I mentioned, I felt morally obligated to plead guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident. No words on my part can possibly express the terrible pain and suffering I feel over this tragic incident. This last week has been an agonizing one for me and for the members of my family. And the grief we feel over the loss of a wonderful friend will remain with us the rest of our lives. These events, the publicity, innuendo, and whispers which have surrounded them, and my admission of guilt this morning, raises the question in my mind of whether my standing among the people of my state has been so impaired that I should resign my seat in the United States Senate.
We were being called on to be super indulgent about the senator and what had happened in that car that night. By the time the television speech occurred, there was an expectation in this speech that questions would be answered, that surely they couldn't hold out this long, that they had to come forth with something, they had to give a coherent story to satisfy all of these questions: the car, the girl, the time she was in the car, what his movements were, who he called, why he didn't report the accident, how could a night go by, didn't anybody see him, all of these things. What happened to the party? Were they drunk? I mean, it's endless. We thought that some of these things would be answered in the television speech. And of course, all the television speech did was to further occlude the events and only add to the confusion, and certainly to a deep, deep skepticism this thing was rigged.
They never explained the accident. They couldn't explain the accident, so they turned it into a political PR problem. Keep those cards and letters going. You had what amounted to an election in which there was only one candidate, and his party workers got to count the votes. And they said, oh, all of the telegrams and the letters that we're getting are 8-1 for Ted. Were they? Were those letters and telegrams ever made public? Are they part of the record of Chappaquiddick? Are there any archives that you can go back and examine how many letters say, resign, you bum, you killed that girl, get out of the Senate?
There was a political speech. He is a politician, a very good one. It wasn't a speech to Mr. and Mrs. Kopechne necessarily. It was not a speech to his children necessarily. It was not a speech to the lawyers necessarily. It wasn't a speech to the journalists, certainly. It was a speech to his electorate. And if you get in your head that it was a political speech, and that's what its purpose was, then you say, nice job.
So Kennedy's political survival was now seen to be more important than the truth. Perhaps this explains some other curious aspects of the case. In particular, the question of why there had been no autopsy remained unexplained. Even Dr. Mills, the medical examiner, didn't seem too sure.
Did you request an autopsy?
Actually, not in those exact words.
Not in those exact words,
Could
no.
you tell me the exact words, Doctor?
I stated to the district attorneys...
If the district attorney advised it...
under the particular circumstances that I would like an autopsy.
Could you restate that, please?
I'm sorry. I had sent word to the district attorney's office the particular circumstances of the case and asked if, under these circumstances, if they felt an autopsy should be done, I would like to have it done.
The spotlight was now on the district attorney, Denise, the only person with the authority to initiate further legal action. But he was caught in a dilemma between his legal duty and his sympathy for Kennedy. However, he finally decided to act.
Well, basically, I am not satisfied with the finding that was made at the scene of the accident. I feel that the opinion rendered by the assistant medical examiner at that time is not sufficient.
Basically, he wanted to help Kennedy. There's no question in my mind about that. He was really pushed into this investigation. I think he was hoping it would just, in fact, I know he was hoping it would just wash away and that'd be the end of it. But through the pressure of the media and probably everybody else involved, he had to step in and do something.
The scene now shifted to the imposing courthouse at Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, within whose jurisdiction Mary Jo Kopechne was buried. District Attorney Denise now sought the exhumation of the body of Mary Jo Kopechne for an autopsy. The request was made before Judge Bernard Breminski.
Could we defer that until the statement's over? Then anything you'd like, we'd be very happy to accommodate you. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning, shortly before lunch, Attorney Edmund Denise, the District Attorney of the Southern District of Massachusetts, and his staff presented to me a petition for the exhumation and autopsy of the body of Miss Kopechne. At this meeting and presentation of the petition, Attorney Joseph Flanagan, Esquire, and John O'Connor, Esquire, verbally filed their appearances on behalf of Joseph A. Kopechne and Gwen L. Kopechne, the parents of the deceased.
A few weeks before, Mrs. Kopechne had been quoted in the press as favouring an autopsy, but now, unaccountably, the Kopechnes opposed it without elaboration.
We feel that nothing will be gained by exhuming the body at this time.
I'm a parent too. And I know that in those circumstances, I probably would be indecisive at times. Yes, no, maybe, why not, why? So if people in the press caught her at various stages, I'm not a bit surprised that she said yes one day, no another day, maybe another day after that. And ultimately, I think it's a matter of religious conviction, personal conviction, moral judgments, and the rest of it. And I think I know, because I listened to them many times, how strongly they felt about it. What was done, it was over, and nothing was going to change that. And maybe at God's peace was a good way to have it be.
The law in Pennsylvania holds that exhumation and autopsy should not be ordered unless it is clearly established that good cause and urgent necessity for such action exists. Said action should not be taken except on a strong showing. The law will not reach into the grave in search of any facts except in the rarest of cases.
The man who would have performed the autopsy and was called as an expert witness believed that this was such a case.
The issues basically were, number one, whether an autopsy could help even after exhumation, and the answer was yes. Second, whether the autopsy could establish beyond any reasonable doubt the drowning, and the answer again is yes, both by exclusion of other causes of death, such as injuries, and by a more complete examination. And therefore, these were the two basic reasons for basic issues, and the answer to both was yes. I mean, that the autopsy was necessary, that the autopsy could help, that the autopsy could, even in an embalmed body and buried for a period of time, could be very helpful, depending on the condition of the body, of course, which no one could predict.
So it came as a surprise that in spite of the weight of expert testimony favouring an autopsy, the judge rejected the request.
The experts for the Mary Jo Kopechne's mother and dad were quite concrete. They were sure that the cause of death was by drowning. Now, the experts for the petitioners, Mr. Denise's side of the case, said we could find this, we could find that, we could find this, and it was a very, very speculative situation. And I would say that if I granted the autopsy, then that would give rise to more speculation. And I accepted the fact that it was a classic case by drowning upon weighing the testimony of both of the experts.
The decision came as a relief to Mary Jo's parents.
This means that I'll come up here very, very often to visit my daughter. I couldn't have faced coming back and going up to the cemetery, and I honestly mean this, I could never have gone up to that cemetery again if I'd known it had been disturbed.
Despite the denial of the autopsy, District Attorney Denise, under continued public pressure, sought a full inquest into the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. But legal manoeuvrings delayed the hearing until January. We now know during that period Bernie Flynn, who was then a detective working for Denise, decided on his own initiative to make contact with the Kennedy camp to keep them advised of the progress of the case. Shortly before the inquest, Flynn was summoned to meet with Kennedy's brother-in-law, Stephen Smith, and lawyer Jack Miller at Boston Airport.
So we went to a lounge nearby, and we ordered a drink. And Stephen Smith asked me if any other developments had occurred. And I told him no. I said, the same as I told Jack down in Washington, we have nothing else. I said, Kennedy can go into that inquest, stay with the story, don't change it, and he's home free. If Ted Kennedy was telling the truth, if everything he said was truthful, Stephen Smith wouldn't need me. Jack Miller wouldn't have to interview me. You know, if I'm in a situation like that and somebody approached me and said, I can help you, but if I'm telling the truth, I say, go to hell. I don't need you. I told the truth. But see, that didn't occur. They wanted to talk to me. They want to know what was going on. So there's no question in my mind that they were afraid of something.
The inquest finally took place in January 1970 at Edgartown Courthouse. Senator Kennedy gave evidence, as did the 5 surviving boiler room girls who had attended the party. But the judge was not at all convinced by the Kennedy account of the accident. He specifically did not believe that Kennedy had turned onto the dirt road by mistake. When the judge's findings were finally published, Kennedy vehemently rejected them.
It's my own personal view that the inferences and ultimate conclusions are not satisfactory, and I reject those. This is now made public, and as it should be, and the ultimate decision will be with the public, as it should be.
In his inquest report, Judge Boyle very, very clearly says, "I don't believe the testimony." And his conclusion was that Ted Kennedy was probably guilty of having operated his automobile in a negligent manner and had contributed to the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. That is virtually an indictment. He came as close to making an indictment without making one.
In the absence of anything conclusive emerging from the inquest, theories about what really happened abounded, and not all of them found Kennedy heroic or blameless. One particularly horrifying theory, expounded by the diver John Farrar, that has continued its currency over 25 years, holds Kennedy responsible for abandoning Mary Jo Kopechne to a lingering death by suffocation after she had exhausted an air bubble trapped in the submerged car. Farrar saw air coming from the car when it was upturned.
That was one of the initial alarm bells that went off in my mind, which led me to believe that she had suffocated rather than drowned. The fact that a great amount of air would have been encapsulated in the automobile when it first went into the water. The fact that we found the trunk virtually dry, which is the major egress of air, which would have caused through the trunk itself, because that's the high point of the automobile. And I think most importantly is the fact that she was found in a positively buoyed condition. She did not drown. By virtue of the fact that her lungs had not filled with water. Mary Jo was a very slim individual, and with her lungs evacuated of air, she would have been negatively buoyed. She would have sunk.
It would be a difficult problem to differentiate in an autopsy, even if it was done right away before embalming, to differentiate between suffocation and drowning. Certainly the findings that Dr. Mills at least described are more consistent with drowning than plain suffocation, although the pulmonary edema can be very severe in cases of suffocation.
Pulmonary edema is a swelling of the tissues of the lungs which can cause internal bleeding.
Usually you think in terms of copious amounts of water when an individual drowns. I was surprised at the small amount of water which Dr. Mills was able to remove by compressing her chest, and I was also surprised by the large amount of blood froth. I won't say large, but there was a considerable amount of blood froth which exuded from her mouth and nose and drained down the side of her cheek and onto her back.
If you're in the middle of the night, dark water, upside down in a car, in an air bubble, and alive, one would suppose the instinct would be to try to get out of that place, and you'd be moving, scratching, scrambling, doing anything. Even if consciously your mind said, I'm just going to lie here and die, your body, the human organism, is of such a nature that it gets frantic to try to get out. It's just plain obvious. Broken glass, upside down in a car, dark water, dark night, and no marks anywhere. It says to me that the woman was not alive, consciously alive, when she drowned.
But John Farrar persists in his belief that she was.
It's too bad that the girl had to die. Had we been alerted that night, I think that we would have been able to remove her in 25 minutes, which was the same amount of time that we were able to remove her the following day. That hump in the middle here was not here then.
Yeah. Will you take it right into the head wall? Good.
Did Mary Jo die slowly and horrifically of suffocation, or did she drown within moments? The evidence of the time is scant and opinions have become deeply entrenched. To settle the dispute once and for all, we called in one of America's leading crash experts, Bill Fisher. Fisher incorporated the latest techniques available to forensic science with on-the-spot measurements.
Down a half. Good, hold it.
When Fisher first looked at pictures of the car, the extent of the damage seemed to indicate that the car might have had a previous collision with a solid object.
The absence of any striations or movement markers in the paint shows us that it did not hit anything else prior to going off the bridge. It's the water that caused this damage. And I was puzzled by this. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. But I wrote away to a database which gives me the specifications of the vehicle, height, width, length, and the position of the center of gravity. And I found out that the car was 80 inches wide and that it went off the bridge at an angle such that when it went off the edge of the bridge, the right front tire went off first. And as it did so, the car would begin to rotate, which would have been from the left rear corner to the right front. So that when the car came down and hit the water, it hit it dead flat on the side, so that the water had no place to go. It was incompressible, and it caused a condition of hydraulic shock. And that's what collapsed the side of the car. I put together a drawing of the car as it would appear if it were in the pond. I also put on the damage in the drawing to compare with the damage shown in the photograph. And as you'll recall, the photograph shows that the right rear door on the passenger side is ruptured. In fact, it's peeled back all the way down to the rocker panel, which would have been toward the surface. Now, because that door was ruptured, the passenger compartment could not have contained any air. The water coming into the car from the broken windows and the open window on the driver's side would have percolated right up into and completely filled the passenger compartment within a relatively short period of time. So basically, there's absolutely no reason to believe that an air pocket could have existed in that car for any period of time. I first became aware of this issue when I saw that drawing in a book. And I later questioned Mr. Farrar precisely with what he felt was the reason for a water level to be shown in that diagram. And he told me that it was his best estimate or guess as to what the water level might have been when the car first entered the pond. There is absolutely no scientific reliability or validity connected with that drawing. If you took actual dimensions and the damages of that car and put it on that drawing, you'd see that the ruptured door panel goes, again, up to the rocker panel, and the air would have escaped. So it is a fantasy that there would have been water or an air pocket within that car. And it is a myth that has been perpetrated over a number of years that has absolutely no scientific reliability behind it.
Bill Fisher's investigation has finally laid the ghost of the air bubble theory, a theory which has diverted attention from the real issues. For the main planks of Kennedy's story remain inconsistent. Too much is left unexplained.